Thank you very much, Greg. And I've said this before when I've been introduced for speeches, but I will repeat it again tonight. When I hear that description of my careers, it just kind of makes it sound as if I couldn't hold a job, doesn't it? But, it's been a wonderful career so far, and it's hopefully not over yet. And so good evening, Madam President, and Sir President as well, Stuart. Nice to see you here as well, and honored guests and friends and family of Stapleford's, and ladies and gentlemen. And what a nice audience this is. I recognize so many people in the audience. First off, from living in Regina on several occasions, but also during my term as Lieutenant Governor. So a good welcome to all of you. I'm particularly honored to be invited to give this talk tonight, to be recognized by the University of Regina. And I was being very careful in making sure which university I was talking about. You know, I was told a story recently of a very special guest at the University of Calgary. And it was an honorary degree recipient speaking. And in the speech, at least 5 times, she made mention of receiving this from the University of Alberta. And the audience was getting more and more uncomfortable. And afterwards, someone said, but this is the University of Calgary. Oh, are there 2 universities in Alberta? So I am very well aware of the sensitivities between universities, but I think it's a good, healthy rivalry, and I look forward to even greater cooperation between the 2 universities, and SIAS too, and SIIT in the years ahead. When I was invited to give this talk, and this was well over 6 months ago, I think, wasn't it, when we first started talking about this? And then I had to commit to a topic. And I thought, what am I going to talk about? 6 months from now, what is going to be topical? Well, I said, you know what, I could talk about the Senate and Senate reform, but what happens if it's reformed in the meantime? Then I'll have lost my topic. And I've breathed a sigh of relief. It's still there, and it's pretty well its same form. And so here goes in terms of some of my thoughts on the Senate. You know, Senate, and talking about Senate reform, and those 2 words, Senate reform, is kind of like an oxymoron, isn't it? It hasn't been happening. And it's kind of like the weather. Everybody talks about it, but nobody does anything about it. And I'm going to conclude with a thought on that as well, where the weather is changing, but the Senate isn't. But I think that the Senate, especially as Greg mentioned in the introduction, with the recent scandals, the whole debate on residence and where people are living and what allowances they can claim and travel allowances and all of that sort of thing has brought the Senate into the light even more than ever before. And you know, a good friend of mine who's in the media, must have been about 6-8 months ago, he said to me, Gordon, he said, don't worry about it. The story doesn't have legs. It's not going to last long. And every time I see him, I say to him, so, how about the Senate? That story that doesn't have legs. It's an amazing story because have you noticed nearly every week there's a new angle, a new story, and it's new charges. Just recently we've had RCMP investigations and then charges, and from that we're then going to have court cases. We have the Auditor General doing the review and perhaps even more cases that will perhaps come out of that audit or that review, comprehensive audit as well. So I think that it's going to continue on for some time to come, as well as then the ruling by the Supreme Court on what their opinion is on Senate change. So I asked the question, why do you think that people are so upset about these scandals in the Senate? It seems that people are inordinately upset about it. And I'm no insult to you, Mr. Goodale, but I'm sure if someone in the House of Commons was doing the same sort of thing, people would be annoyed somewhat, but not to the same extent. And I think the reason is, if it's a member of the House of Commons, people can say, damn, I really disapprove of that. I'm going to vote against that person in the next election. There's kind of that pressure release valve to say, I can do something about it. With the Senate, because each of the Senates being appointed, there isn't that recourse to say, well, I'm going to vote against that person in the next election. And I think that is why there is that extra amount of angst or unhappiness whenever there is another scandal or another angle to the scandal with regard to the Senate. I think it's really just because they're appointed with no chance of having that election to correct that situation. I think there's another factor, and it relates to Senator Wallin and Senator Duffy. I don't know, and I'm not going to get into the details of their cases because each is slightly different and there are varying different accounts, and perhaps if it goes to court, more of the details will come out. But I think part of it is due to, first off, with Senator Wallin, I don't know how many young women have said to me, I am so disappointed because she was a role model for me, young women especially. She had a great career in the media. She, when she got fired by the CBC, she had a great following. People took her side and felt very sympathetic towards her. She traveled the world, Canadian representative to the United States. And then as senator, took on some interesting projects. And I think there was that great aura, especially for young women, to say, there's a role model for me. And when that came crashing down, there seemed to be an extraordinary feeling of disappointment. And with regard to Mr. Duffy, being also a member of the media, a media personality, he had developed a reputation as being the man that was fighting corruption in government on behalf of the common people. And then when he becomes part of it, I think again there was that sense of disappointment, like, darn, why is he involved with this sort of thing? There's a third part to why I think the Senate scandal, I hate using the word scandal, but I haven't thought of a better word, whereby I think the media itself is playing it along because there's a certain amount of disappointment on their part. Here are two key representatives from the media, Wallin and Duffy, who in many ways disappointed the media, and perhaps they're getting their own in terms of all of the coverage. That's just an outside theory, but it may be another reason why the story just keeps going on. The story does have legs. The current Prime Minister, Stephen Harper, has made several proposals to change the Senate, and he first said he wasn't going to make appointments with patronage. He was going to wait and not have change. But I think he realized that if, as the numbers as senators were dying or retiring, he was either going to have to make appointments to get a majority in order to bring change. I think he also remembered one of his predecessors, Joe Clark, who left vacancies in the Senate, was then defeated and didn't have a chance later to fill those vacancies. That was likely a factor as well. So once he had the majority, he proposed incremental changes, changing the length of service to a senator, limiting it for, say, 7 years or 9 years, and that was open to debate, open to discussion. He also proposed that provinces would have elections as a way of selecting senators. The province would make that selection, and then the Prime Minister would make a recommendation to the Governor General that that person be appointed. And he argued that neither of those changes would require constitutional amendment. The problem was, and I think his frustration has been, that in appointing senators and having them promise that yes, they were in favor of Senate reform, once they settled into their Senate offices, lost their appeal and their fire for bringing about Senate reform. And I know the Prime Minister has felt very frustrated about that. And so now is waiting for a ruling from the Supreme Court. And I'm not just too sure when that's going to be, perhaps within the next 12 months. It seems that the Supreme Court will make a ruling on various issues with regard to Senate reform. One of the options that they will talk about is it going to require 50% plus 50% of the population in 7 provinces to bring a change? So in other words, you'd have to have at least Ontario and Quebec, Ontario or Quebec, and other 6 provinces to make up half of the population of Canada. Or would it have to be unanimous, meaning all of the provinces, the House of Commons and the Senate, agreeing to that change?